last episode, a shipload of hopeful settlers survived their first brutal winter in the Red River Valley by the skin of their teeth. They had arrived armed for war, but were nearly defeated by starvation, saved only by the ironic charity of their chief rival, the Northwest Company. As they planted their first crops, a fragile hope took root. But in the background, the Nor'westers were already moving against them, quietly buying up the region's vital food source, pemmican. The colony's governor, Miles Macdonell, having faced starvation in the face, was determined to never let his people get that close to the edge again. In the cold of January 1814, he would make a fateful decision. With a stroke of a pen, he would try to secure his colony's future by seizing control of the one resource that mattered more than any other.
And whereas the welfare of the families at present forming settlements on the Red River within the said territory with those on the way to it, passing the winter at York and Churchill forts in Hudson's Bay, as also those who are expected to arrive next autumn, renders it a necessary and indispensable part of my duty to provide for their support. In the yet uncultivated state of the country, the ordinary resources derived from the buffalo and other wild animals hunted within the territory are not deemed more than adequate for the requisite supply. Wherefore, it is hereby ordered that no persons trading in furs or provisions within the territory for the Honourable Hudson's Bay Company or the Northwest Company, or any individual or unconnected traders or persons whatever, shall take out any provisions either of flesh, fish, grain or vegetable procured or raised within the territory by water or land carriage for 1 12-month from the date hereof, save and except what may be judged necessary for the trading parties at this present time within the territory to carry them to their respective destinations, and who may, on due application to me, obtain a licence for the same. The provisions procured and raised as above shall be taken for the use of the colony, and that no loss may accrue to the parties concerned. They will be paid for by British bills at the customary rates, and be it hereby further made known that whosoever shall be detected in attempting to convey out, or shall aid and assist in carrying out or attempting to carry out any provisions prohibited as above, either by water or land, shall be taken into custody and prosecuted as the laws in such cases direct, and the provisions so taken, as well as any goods and chattels, of what nature soever, which may be taken along with them, and also the craft, carriages and cattle instrumental in conveying away the same to any part, but to the settlement on Red River, shall be forfeited. Given under my hand at Fort Dare, the 8th day of January 1814. Miles Macdonell, Governor.
He called it the Pemmican Proclamation. To Macdonell, it was a necessary act of survival, but to the Northwest Company, it was a declaration of economic war, a vital, crippling assault on their continental lifeline. The time for anonymous newspaper articles and legal challenges was over. What follows is a rapid, brutal descent into open conflict. A paper decree leads to armed blockades on frozen rivers, corporate strategy gives way to secret plots and a call to arms. The dream of a peaceful settlement dissolves into a nightmare of intimidation, sabotage, and siege, where neighbor turns against neighbor, and the colony itself is brought to its knees. This is Episode 2, Escalation and Expulsion. The new year of 1814 began under a cloud of uncertainty. Provisions in the Red River colony were dangerously scarce. Governor Miles Macdonell, having watched his settlers nearly starve the winter before, decided to take drastic action. On January 8th, he issued a decree that would echo across the entire Northwest. It would come to be known as the Pemmican Proclamation. On its face, the order was about protecting his people. Macdonell's stated duty was to provide for the families currently in the settlement, as well as those who were on the way. In the proclamation, he argued that given the uncultivated state of the country, the food available from the buffalo hunt was not deemed more than adequate for the requisite supply. Therefore, he ordered that no person trading in furs or provisions within the territory for Hudson's Bay Company, Northwest Company, or any company shall take any provisions, whether it's meat, dried meat, grain, or vegetable. The order was absolute. It effectively nationalized the entire food supply of the district. Both the Northwest Company and even employees of the Hudson's Bay Company formally protested, but Lord Selkirk, as the HBC's majority shareholder, was easily able to deal with his own company's complaints. The Nor'westers, however, were not so easily silenced. But was this proclamation truly about feeding a few hungry settlers? A government official named William Coltman, who was later sent to investigate the conflict, believed it was something far more cunning. Coltman suggested that Governor Macdonell had been waiting for the perfect moment to cripple his rival. That moment came with news from the east. In September 1813, the Americans had won the Battle of Lake Erie, giving them control of the Great Lakes and threatening the NWC's main supply route for transporting goods and provisions. The Nor'westers themselves would later testify that the loss of Lake Erie made them more dependent on Red River pemmican than ever before. By issuing the proclamation now, Macdonell wasn't just protecting his food supply, he was launching a strategic attack designed to starve the Northwest Company out of the entire region. This was no longer a simple dispute. It was a calculated act of economic warfare. Macdonell had made his move, and the Nor'westers, now squeezed from both the north and the south, had no choice but to retaliate. The Northwest Company partners treated Governor Macdonell's proclamation with contempt, completely disregarding it. A paper threat was one thing, but Macdonell now had to prove that he would back his words with force. The Cold War on the Red River was about to turn hot. The first clash came in March 1814. A clerk from the colony, John Warren, led about 15 armed colonists to a Métis hunting camp at Turtle River to secure provisions. When several NWC sleighs arrived to do the same, Warren's men stood their ground, forcing the Nor'westers to retreat empty-handed. The confrontations quickly escalated. Hearing that a Northwest Company boat loaded with pemmican was heading down the Assiniboine River, Macdonell dispatched John Warren again, this time with 50 men and 2 field cannons. His orders were to fire muskets at any passing NWC boats, and if they refused to stop, to sink them with cannon fire. Here, however, the colonists drew a line. They openly refused to obey the order to fire artillery on the canoes. The Nor'westers, getting word of the blockade, sent a small party overland to intercept their own boat. They found the crew and ordered them to hide their precious cargo, burying 96 bags of pemmican in a secret cache before the boat continued on, now empty. When the baymen at the blockade saw the empty boat, they grew suspicious. After a tense search of the riverbank that lasted 1 or 2 days, they discovered the hidden pemmican and triumphantly hauled it back to Port Douglas. The colonists then blocked the overland high road as well, disrupting not only the NWC but also the local Métis and First Nations who used the route. When one Indigenous family was taken prisoner, the local Métis were enraged and offered to help the NWC attack the blockade, an offer the Nor'westers declined for the moment. On May 29th, Macdonell launched his most audacious move yet. He sent the colony sheriff, John Spencer, to raid the Northwest Company's post at Rivière-la-Souris. The haul was staggering: 500 bags of pemmican, 96 kegs of grease, and 9 bales of dried meat. Spencer also confiscated a chest of NWC guns, specifically to prevent them from being traded to the Métis for hunting buffalo. With new cannon batteries being built on the riverbanks and NWC canoes being captured, the region was on the verge of open war. In a desperate attempt to prevent bloodshed and to stop his own men from starving, the NWC's John Macdonell met with Governor Macdonell on June 18th to negotiate a peace. They reached a fragile agreement. Macdonell would keep 200 bags of pemmican and return the rest, and the NWC would supply the colony with food during the coming winter. According to later testimony, the terms were more or less followed. For a moment, a tense quiet fell over the Red River. But this was only a ceasefire, not a surrender. The Nor'westers had been humiliated, and their supply line shattered. In the halls of their headquarters at Fort William, they were already planning a far more decisive retaliation. The truce of June 1814 was nothing more than a pause to reload. That summer, at the Northwest Company's annual meeting at their grand headquarters of Fort William, the partners gathered to plot their revenge. They came up with a two-faced plan. The official strategy was subtle. They would issue arrest warrants for Governor Macdonell and his lieutenants, John Spencer and John Warren. Then they would undermine the settlement from within by offering the disgruntled colonists free passage to a new life in Upper Canada. Partners Duncan Cameron and Alexander Macdonell were put in charge of the operation. But unofficially, hidden from the meeting's minutes, a much darker plot was hatched. The real plan was to attack the colony. They would first disarm it and then pay their indigenous allies from Lac Rouge and Fond du Lac to destroy it completely. While this wasn't written down, evidence of the conspiracy is abundant. The NWC officer in charge of the Fond du Lac district later received a letter from Duncan Cameron stating he had orders to destroy the colony. The chief of the Fond du Lac Ojibwe also testified that he had been offered all the trade goods at 3 separate posts to make war on the English, an offer he refused. The Nor'westers' plan went into motion that September. Within days of arriving in the Red River District, Duncan Cameron arrested Sheriff John Spencer. As Spencer was being taken away by canoe, a group of furious colonists broke into the fort's arm locker to mount a rescue. Spencer himself had to convince his would-be saviors to stand down and not kill the Nor'westers. That evening, the tension boiled over when one colonist took a shot at Duncan Cameron himself, but missed. Governor Macdonell retaliated, sending notices to all NWC posts in the region, ordering them to abandon their positions within 6 months. He then raised a volunteer militia from among his settlers, invoking the HBC's royal charter to create a formal fighting force. The conflict now entered a new phase, an arms race. In Montreal, Lord Selkirk was raising a private army. After being granted only a small personal guard of 14 regular British soldiers, he used the HBC charter to recruit his own force. He hired 180 HBC employees, and crucially, about 150 professional soldiers recently discharged from the Swiss de Meuron and de Watteville regiments, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. Selkirk paid them out of his own pocket, armed them with muskets and bayonets, and they retained their distinctive military uniforms of red coats and black shakos. The NWC scrambled to keep pace, hiring their own discharged sergeant from the de Meuron regiment and convincing 2 lieutenants to join them on a leave of absence, though they continued to wear their uniforms. The company's partners began acting as military officers for their own Corps of Voyageurs, with Duncan Cameron signing his letters captain. While the armies mustered, the situation on the ground devolved into a cycle of harassment and retaliation. That winter, Métis allies of the NWC began tormenting the settlers, stampeding the buffalo herds the colonists were trying to hunt. A series of tit-for-tat captures and arrests followed, with the colonists seizing NWC men and the Métis, led by Cuthbert Grant, capturing colonists in return. The chaos ended only when Governor Macdonell met with the Nor'westers and arranged a tense prisoner exchange. A fragile peace returned, but the board was now set for a much larger conflict. Both sides had professional soldiers, military command structures, and a burning desire to eliminate the other. The secret plot was in motion, and the call to arms had been answered. With both sides armed and ready for a fight, the Northwest Company partner Duncan Cameron began to execute his company's plan to destroy the Red River colony from within. In 1815, he began a campaign of psychological warfare, designed to break the settlers' will. The strategy was simple, a mix of terror and temptation. Cameron's men would threaten to, quote, unleash the Indians on the colony. while at the same time offering the colonists free passage and a new start in Upper Canada. Not every Nor'wester had the stomach for this kind of work. A company clerk named Ollie Macaulay flatly refused to sell firearms and ammunition to the Métis when he knew they were meant to be used against the colony. For this act of conscience, he was severely punished. At the next company rendezvous at Fort William, Macaulay was publicly humiliated. He was forbidden from dining at the partners' mess table. The other clerks were ordered to shun him, and he was sent back to Montreal in a fully loaded canoe. A clear sign of disgrace in the voyageur world. The message was clear. Loyalty to the company was absolute. Slowly, Cameron's campaign of intimidation, coupled with the genuinely harsh living conditions, began to work. Disgruntled settlers started to abandon the colony. The man left in temporary command, Archibald MacDonald, threatened to turn the colony's own cannons on anyone who tried to leave, a move that would backfire spectacularly. On April 3rd, the colony imploded. A group of rebellious settlers, led by a man named George Campbell, detained the colony's officers in the mess room of Fort Douglas. While the imprisoned leaders watched helplessly through the windows, the mutineers broke into the warehouses. They stole a number of cannons, weapons, and tools, loading them into horse-drawn sleighs and making off with the colony's entire defense arsenal. They then delivered the stolen guns directly into the hands of Duncan Cameron and the Northwest Company. At the NWC's Fort Gibraltar, blacksmiths immediately set to work building field carriages for the stolen artillery. As these tensions flared, forces began to gather. The NWC's ranks swelled with employees, freemen, and Métis, as well as Cree warriors from the north. For a time, the local Saulteaux, or Ojibwa, arrived to protect the settlers, telling them their presence would be enough to deter a Cree attack. But after 2 weeks of guarding the colony without being compensated in any fashion for their help, the Saulteaux departed, offended. Shortly after they left, a dark omen appeared. 10 or 12 of the colony's cows were found dead, their hides riddled with arrows. No one knew for sure who had done it, whether it was the Métis or the disgruntled Saulteaux. But the message was unmistakable. The time for threats and promises was over. The attacks were about to begin. With the psychological warfare now being over, and the colony's defenses stolen and morale shattered, the Northwest Company's field commander, Alexander Macdonell, finally moved in for the kill. With a small army of around 60 voyageurs and Métis, he established a camp at a place called Frog Plain, just a few miles from Fort Douglas. The war for the Red River had begun. His first move was to cut the colony off from the river. His men erected a battery of 4 cannons, their ammunition, freshly forged cannonballs, supplied by the NWC blacksmith at Fort Gibraltar. On June 10th, the first shots were exchanged when colonists fired on a Métis supply party and promptly returned fire. No one was hurt, but a line had been crossed. Coincidentally, that very same day, a canoe arrived at the NWC's fort bearing news from the east. The War of 1812 was over. The messenger delivered a stunning proclamation: peace with all the world, except Red River. The Nor'westers and their allies immediately began to terrorize the settlement. They stole the colony's cattle. When 3 colonists tried to drive the animals back, they were chased off by gunfire. One NWC man, John Early, later apologized after his gun misfired, stating he surely would have killed one of the colonists as his gun was loaded with 2 balls. The Métis now took the lead in breaking the spirit of the settlers. Day and night, they paraded in front of the settlement, singing war songs to intimidate the families huddled inside their homes. They abducted settlers who strayed too far and began to dismantle the empty houses, burning some of them to the ground. The remaining colonists continued to desert, many taking what was left of the colony's arms and ammunition with them. The noose tightened. The Nor'westers built another cannon battery, this one directly opposite Fort Douglas. For its defenses, they built a breastwork made partially from the wood of the houses they had just dismantled. Then came the attacks. At least 4 times in June, NWC forces opened fire on the colony, shooting at the dwelling houses from hidden positions. The colonists always returned fire, but they were taking losses. 4 men were wounded, and John Warren, one of Macdonell's top men, was nearly killed when his own large wall gun exploded. Finally, the Métis occupied the settlement itself, taking over the remaining houses and setting up their headquarters in the home of a man named John Pritchard. More colonists were evicted as their homes were put to the torch. After one last attack on June 11th, which raged for half an hour, the defenders reached their breaking point. The surviving colonists gathered and approached their governor, Miles Macdonell. Their dream was over. They had only one suggestion left: that he should surrender himself to the enemy to finally end the violence. The colonists' plea hung heavy in the air of the besieged Fort Douglas. The governor looked at his exhausted people and saw their dream of a new life turning to ash. On June 15th, the Nor'westers had launched another attack, trampling crops and taking prisoners. The next day, a message arrived from NWC partners Alexander Mackenzie and Simon Fraser. The terms were simple. If Governor Macdonell surrendered himself, the colony would be left in peace. Thinking he could save his people, Governor Macdonell agreed. He made a verbal deal that the colony would keep some pemmican, and the NWC would help provision them through the next winter. On June 22nd, he walked out of Fort Douglas and departed as a prisoner, bound for Fort William. The peace he had purchased lasted only a few hours. Later that very day, the Métis resumed firing on the remaining colonists. The promise was a lie. HBC officials met with the Métis leaders to negotiate a new peace, but this time the terms were absolute. The final agreement was a death sentence for the colony. It stated that all settlers retire immediately from the river and no appearance of the colony is to remain. All past grievances were to be totally forgiven, and anyone who left peacefully would not be harmed. There was no choice. The settlers loaded what they could into boats and fled north towards an HBC outpost called Jack River House, guarded on their journey by local Cree who took pity on them. Behind them on June 24th, the Métis put the colony to the torch. They burned Fort Douglas, the mill, the stables, and the settlers' homes, cutting holes in the walls on the windward side to ensure the fire would spread quickly. The colony's goods and horses were distributed among the Métis as spoils of war. It seemed to be the end. But then a glimmer of hope. At Jack River House, the desperate refugees ran into a man named Colin Robertson. Robertson was an aggressive HBC trader, leading a brigade of 160 voyageurs to the Athabasca region to wage war on the NWC there. Convinced by the settlers' plight, he changed his plans. He would stay and help them reclaim their land. On August 19th, Robertson led the settlers back to the smoking ruins of their settlement and began to rebuild. That October, his men captured NWC partner Duncan Cameron himself. Under interrogation, Cameron admitted that most of the colony's stolen guns were stored at the nearby NWC post, Fort Gibraltar, the very post used to stage the attack. Robertson's men promptly seized the fort and its cache of weapons. In November 1815, a new governor, Robert Semple, arrived with 160 new settlers and Hudson's Bay men to reinforce the reborn colony. But this victory was tempered by grim news from the north. The smaller force Robertson had sent to Athabasca had met with disaster. Arriving late and low on food, 20 of the men perished from hunger and exposure, and the rest were forced to surrender to the Northwest Company. The Red River Colony, though, was alive again, larger and more defiant than before, but the war had spread, and the Nor'westers had proven in the frozen lands of Athabasca that they were still powerful, still ruthless, and very far from defeated. Next time on Canadian History with Stephen Wilson, the conflict reaches its bloody climax. The Northwest Company mobilizes for a final, decisive assault on the Red River Colony. A new governor makes a fateful choice, marching out to meet his enemies in a confrontation that will go down in history as the Battle of Seven Oaks.